in policy making spaces, this conversation about the obsession with digital only policies, and also that AI is inevitable or that infrastructures are inevitable. This, I think, we have to, in principle, philosophically also oppose. But I agree with Dona that infrastructures or any developmental model, for example, always comes with these very pressing concerns about how communities are affected and which communities are affected.
I wanted to ask you, while I have you here, if you've been receiving complaints or if you are aware of folks reaching out about data center construction impact on drinking water quality.
Calls are growing across the United States for moratoriums.
The AI race is far from being over. Truth is, we're only at the beginning.
Welcome to the second episode of our special podcast series, Where the Cloud Touches the Ground. Today in our virtual studio, I am joined by two guests all the way from India. Arpita Kanjilal, who is the head of research and communications at the Digital Empowerment Foundation. In the organization, she leads the Just AI and drives strategic partnerships while also working closely with civil society organizations, government bodies, and industry stakeholders to improve collective advocacy efforts for community-centric policymaking. Welcome, Arpita.
Thank you so much.
We are lucky also to have here Dona Mathew, who is working as a senior researcher at Digital Future Lab, where she examines the implications of AI adoption in global majority context, more specifically in legal settings and the AI supply. Hello, Dona.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Her recent report with Meredith Stinger that we're certainly going to talk about today explores the data center discourse in India, broader public policy narratives on AI adoption, and also emerging issues around pollution, energy use, and water consumption near data center sites. My name is Susanna. I power Leitmotiv Communication Operations, and here with me is also my colleague Max Schulze. He is Leitmotiv's co-founder and also a former software engineer who worked on core infrastructure and services at large tech companies. Hi, Max.
Hi, thanks for having me.
In today's conversation, we will dive into a case study on what the AI boom and its social and environmental impacts mean for the affected communities and researchers. Together, we will unpack what's happening in Mekaguda and Begaikancha. These are India's two villages in the Telangana state, where farmers and local communities filed a high court petition against Microsoft and dozens of other companies and government bodies because of illegal land occupation and industrial waste affecting their businesses. Interestingly, since 2016, Telangana has been one of India's most proactive states for data center development, also the first in the country to introduce a dedicated state-level data center policy. Donna, first question to you. Your report that mapped India's data centers mentions that India currently doesn't have a standardized definition of a data center. Could you tell me why that is a problem, and maybe what would the most effective definition would be according to you?
Sure, that's a great question, and just to also give some context on where that particular finding also came from was that in sometime last year, a tax tribunal in India had asked the government of India why data centers had not been defined, and their concern in asking that question was that anyone who has a room with one single computer that is storing data and running some processing could then claim tax incentives and subsidies that the government is offering to data centers. So that is why that it's also an issue, because the government is different state governments are offering a lot of tax incentives and subsidies to data centers. With the recent budget in 2026, there are more incentives that have been promised to foreign companies setting up data centers in India. And therefore defining what a data center kind of becomes important in this narrative where a lot of policies enable the construction and development of data centers. But then if you don't have a definition, the question remains, and who can then take some of these benefits. In terms of defining a data center, I think there must be like different aspects or angles to kind of look at. So one is kind of like the definition that the Uptime Institute uses around the different data center tiers, depending on the kind of redundancy that they have. They might have some downtime. For example, tier one data centers can afford downtime for maintenance, so for fault detection, for fault maintenance, etc. They can have some downtime compared to your hyperscalers, which are usually the tier 4 kind of data centers, which have very low downtime. Like they need to be up most of the time because you cannot afford, for example, like banking sector or like financial health sectors cannot probably afford health data being down or financial data being down for a period of time. So there are these different angles to kind of look at, and at the end of the day, a data center is a construction that's built for machines, right? Like it's not to house people, it's construction for machines. So usually has like vast physical compute infrastructure that's placed in it. So a definition that kind of goes into that accepts and acknowledges this different kind of tiers that exist for data centers would, I think, make more sense in this context. What we're also seeing in state policies is different kinds of definitions for things like data center units, data center parks. State policies try to define that depending on the number of these structures or infrastructures that are already there. So bringing these different kind of definitions together would make more sense.
Can I ask, when you mentioned that there are tax incentives for the various kinds of data centers, like what is the expected return for society by like giving taxpayer money? Obviously, you have some kind of expectation, right, in terms of economic development or something. What is the promise that's backing up this spending?
Yeah, that was one of the fundamental questions that we were asking ourselves when we were kind of looking into this research in the Indian context on why are states offering so many incentives to data centers. And the more popular narrative is, of course, around like job generation, not even in the direct economy, in the surrounding economy. So having a data center, like a large scale or hyperscaler setting up a data center here would generate IT jobs in the surrounding economy. Because our question also came from the fact that data centers don't generate as many direct jobs. So you don't need a lot of people to operate a data center. So therefore, the incentive is unclear. But why states continue to offer tax incentives and offer guaranteed electricity, water supply, etc., that is being questioned now. So a lot of states in India, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, they're actually revisiting their data center policies because they're realizing that they actually don't have the resources that the state policies are guaranteeing to data centers. So also kind of trying to think through, because in the US, I think last year there was a report that came about how states or like local municipalities, counties experience a lot of revenue loss from offering these tax incentives to data centers. So corporations, allowing corporations to set up their infrastructure here. But at the end of the day, you're also losing out on potential revenue that could have come in. In our interviews, folks did mention that perhaps there is some kind of like income tax revenue that may come from this and property tax revenue that might come from this, where those incentives are not offered by the states. But again, this is it still remains like a question that doesn't have a straight answer on why are states keen, other than kind of like this larger digital transformation agenda.
Yeah, it feels speculative, the return. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Arpita, I'm also curious, do you have a definition for us?
I agree with Dona. With I think Dona has covered it very well. Even like just adding a point here that Telangana data center policy, for example, right? It recognizes data centers as essential digital infrastructures, and the reasoning for that is because it classifies data center firms under the Essential Services Act due to their 24-hour, 7 days, 365 degrees role in supporting cloud or e-governance support, open data, digital services, and emerging technology support, right? So it requires infrastructure support, power reliability, single window approvals, fast track approvals, startup support, and fiscal incentives. So this is the reasoning for categorizing data centers under essential infrastructures category. But the question again is, I think what Dona has also asked, that do we equate data centers with essential fundamental access to services like healthcare, education? Are we or electricity? What are who bears the costs of this burden? So if there's uninterrupted power supply that's going in, if there's uninterrupted water supply that's going in, it is a load on the state infrastructure, and it's going to affect not just communities who are living in the vicinity, but also citizens in the state. And we see that already. Like in the state of Telangana, we see, first of all, we see a lot of groundwater depletion because of industrialization, built on which is data centers now, right? And that's one. And then second, we see that in cities, there's increasing need for water tankers. Like this constant need for more water tankers, and it's still not fulfilling the need of the citizens in the state. So when we talk about a definition of data center, I think more than definition, it has to be classification also that we have to account for and have it in clear terms in policy making.
Yeah, and there's also, I'm guessing, nobody can check or prove what's inside the data center. So assuming the entire healthcare sector of Telangana would actually run on a data center, we would not know if that's true or not true, right? We can't actually check. So classifying everything as essential, we have similar things here. And then, you go inside and turns out there's maybe a big social media firm running just videos from that site, supplying that with scarce water resources or electrical resources. Sounds a bit, wrong priorities. Let's put it like this. Right.
Arpita, I'm glad you brought up the Telangana local communities because that's a very important aspect of the data center debate. And these are also communities that you've been closely working with your research team. So could you tell us a little bit why you decided to come to Telangana in person specifically, and how productive your fieldwork was there?
Right. So we've been tracking the developments in digital ecosystem broadly, because our work as DEF is constantly to navigate how communities and citizens are, engaging with the ecosystem. And today in India, everything that was manual has moved to a digital modus operandi. So all our e-governance, access to welfare services, everything is tied to digital identity. Today's citizenship is actually, you can equate it to digital citizenship. It's literally that, right? So if you're not a digital citizen, you are completely deprived of any. So in this entire landscape, when AI came in, right? So we started looking at how AI at the level of design, development, deployment, and adoption, how is it again impacting communities, and how a community is navigating this ecosystem. There we started seeing that data centers, of course, right, coming in, and we were also trying to understand what its implications are. And that's when we of course read the article from Rest of World, which brought to light the only contestation in India, the first of only contestations in India, where a person who is a village head, an elected village head, took a stand and accompanied with so many farmers from the region, filed a PIL, public interest litigation, highlighting that there has been an alleged encroachment, right, of their land, of their lake, water body, etc. Now, when that developed, and of course, so it grew. This discourse slowly has started growing in India's policy making spaces. It's still very marginal because most of conversations are very innovation centric, or maybe at best, how to make innovation centric more inclusive by ensuring that AI developers are more ethical, and what guardrails they follow to ensure AI applications are not just supply driven but are more demand driven. But the study of the impact of the AI infrastructures itself is not a priority, because we saw that during the India AI Impact Summit, so many investments were made without even worrying a little bit about how it could actually impact the social and environmental uh, aspects, right? So therefore, our interest grew, and then with support of Association for Progressive Communications, we could pursue research for a short period of time, for 8 months. So we selected Telangana, one, because Telangana has been at the forefront of digitalization. If you see in the country, Telangana is one of those states which is always spearheaded in this area. And we knew that Telangana would become the hub. And then, of course, it's spreading out across India. We could see that Telangana could be a very important place of study because it has a data center policy as in place already. I mean, of course, fraught with contradictions, fraught with a lot of like questions that we need to address, but at least it has something that you can study and verify. So that was the first reason. Second was the contestation came from that space. Third, of course, it's my one of the languages I speak. So it was very important that a researcher knows the language and understands the local dynamics to navigate that space as well. So for all of these combined factors, we decided to go in, and we of course started with understanding the region which is around Microsoft data center, and then we were looking for another data center region, and we did a snowballing technique. We used the snowballing technique, and we again reached out to another community, which is Begari Kancha, which is around the Amazon data center. So the idea was not to study Microsoft or Amazon in particular, but we were looking for communities who were in the region of any data center, who could give us an idea about what could be the potential harms or what could be the potential opportunities that communities feel or understand as data centers are coming up in their region.
And what did you find was like the prevailing narrative? Like, what is the story that the local communities tell themselves on why these data centers are here, and why is it linked to that, the feeling of I am a digital citizen, and these things are basically the machinery that enables that, or do they think there will be jobs? What is the narrative that you hear?
It is a mix of many reactions. So if you look at, and it's very hyperlocal and contextual, right? So when you go to Mekaguda, where there has been some contestation in the region by a village elected head, right? There is some consciousness built among some of the people, right, who are in mostly positions of power in their own community. So that's one, right? But that doesn't therefore entail that the communities at large are very conscious or are very aware, because we always tend to all homogenize communities as well, like which we shouldn't. Of course, yes, it's a community centric perspective, but the villages in India or in any place are again power laden with local asymmetries, like hierarchies of caste, gender, region, which is the political power, who's running the government, and who are the elected representatives. Are they aligned to the current regime or not? So there are and then of course another additional point is the industries that are there already. They have a relationship with the communities already for decades. So when we think about community response, it's extremely contextual, and it's also dependent on where they're positioned. So if there's a person with land ownership, and that's not assigned land, so there's a difference between a person who has ownership of the land versus a person in Telangana who has been given an assigned land by the government for empowerment. So then, like a person with land would respond very differently from a person who does not have ownership over land, whose land is being taken away. So having said that, initially when we went to Mekaguda, there was certain consciousness in a group of people, and then through our engagement, it also became more. I think as we started trying to reach out to more stakeholders, I think that conversation itself, I think, opens up some conversation in their communities. So that gradually happened, right? But Mekaguda is a very different scenario from Begari Kancha. When we went to Begari Kancha, there was literally no response. Why I started off with uh, Anganwadi as a space. Anganwadi Asha workers, so they are basically health workers. They are basically women volunteers with the government who provide essential services to pregnant women, to children, basically, who are left behind by families who are at work, who are doing construction work, for example, etc. So it's basically a provision by the government to take care of children and pregnant women, right? So that's the space where I started, and they are most powerless in the hierarchy of the people who are taking care of these aspects, right? So now, when I went there initially, there was no response. First of all, the fear is that uh, how would people react, or how would there be any problem if they share their actual responses. So people are very guarded initially, so it took us a while, etc. But eventually, because we kept, of course, going back again and again, requesting for time and requesting for conversations, we managed to build some trust. So that's when we slowly came across an activist from the Communist Party of India who led one of the protests in the region against a road that's coming up, a 41-kilometer radial road that's cutting through 19 villages, to basically bring investments for the data centers, for the future city, for the Bharat city that now Telangana is building there around all the data centers. So when we contacted him, he had some say in the community. So there was a lot of, it took time to build trust, etc. But then when we sat with them, there was no lack of consciousness. There's never lack of consciousness, I think, in communities. They always know what their problem is better than any of us, because we go as outsiders with certain assumptions of how it would be impacting. So it's just the difference is whether they are able to use the same language that we use, and to describe their experience or how they feel about the situation. So second important thing is, if you know, in India, and I don't know about the rest of the countries, but in India, data centers are coming up in industrial zones because there's enough infrastructure already built around, right? So then the data centers are all set up in industrial zones, right? In Telangana, it's the same case. Now, in the context of Mekaguda, it is surrounded by pharmaceutical industries and lot of these chemical-based industries, which have given out lot of harmful chemicals through water, which has caused lot of damage to crops, and people lands have become barren over time, and it also affects their health. Across generations, there have been genetic impairments, etc. Right, but that's not the case with Begari Kancha. So their understanding of data center, perception of data center is again very grounded in that fact. So everyone is trying to relate to, okay, if industries could do this to us, then what could data centers do? So they used to ask the question to us. So then we used to try to again like have a conversation and find ways to make understand that this is how data centers have certain challenges versus industrialization, how it offered us challenges, etc. Third aspect about livelihood, right? So industrialization, with all its perils, right, it still offered livelihoods, however menial it did, right? Like even now, there are scores of people whose lands have been taken away or whose lands have gone barren, have become workforce in industries or are now pushed into gig economy, right? So the idea that data centers will provide employment in each household, that people are failing to grasp. That is for sure. So there we had a very interesting person to speak with during our fieldwork, who was an engineer himself. So he's a young graduate, he's an engineer. So I wanted to understand. So if he's an engineer, why is he not getting employed in data center? So because there is a huge skill gap, right? But he said, no, I'm unable to get it. They are getting people from other states. So I work as security officer. So that's also very telling, right? So then like I had, when we went with our team, we had conversations with the elected village representatives in both regions. Mekaguda was very aware among the representatives, but Pigari Kancha, where we were saying that it is a promise, but it doesn't seem probable because there's a huge skill gap. And so how do you understand this? So it was a conversation in that sense.
I was curious because you mentioned there was one activist that you were in contact. So just very quickly to get a grasp of how big this resistance is, or how activism sort of manages to get its way into it. Are there more activists like this?
Communist Party of India, Marxist, CPIM, it's a national party, and they are generally active, and they have a very strong workers unions. If in the political landscape, they are in minority because of the current regime, the way every election we see the center also taking spaces in regional politics. So CPIM has always taken the side of the workers generally, vis-a-vis any kind of land, like any kind of land reassignment or taking away lands, etc. So in this case as well, we have noticed, and we have also interacted with him, that they are the only force in at least these regions we came across who raised an issue or a question with the local administration that without consulting communities, or communities are not willing to give away their lands, then how are you proceeding basically with all these clearances and doing it? When we spoke with CPM, and when we saw that communities are responding when the CPM leader is talking to them, I could see that there is that kind of long-term engagement between the local communities and that organization. So that was very helpful for us to actually navigate the local space.
I see. Maybe a different kind of question for Donna. You mentioned that originally you also wanted to sort of take this in-person approach to data centers, but on a more creative side. So you and Digital Futures Lab were thinking of making a movie on data centers. Could you tell me more about it?
Yes, I think similar origin stories actually. Like we were from also hearing Arpita speak because we were initially interested in documenting how data center impacts are unfolding in India, and one of the materials that we'd read was the Rest of World article by Ananya and Almas, which was documenting the Make a Good High Court petition, and how the flavor of the problem was also very different from the conversations that we were seeing in the Global North. The Global North conversations were mostly on electricity use, price rise, impact on residents' access to energy, electricity, access to water, the Chile case, and in Google. But what we saw in Mikaguda was this very specific impact of like effluent being released into a lake and cattle feeding on that like lake, like using that water, falling sick, and that directly impacting the livelihoods of dairy farmers in that region. So we were also curious on how this kind of impact of data centers might also be different, or there might be like different layers in contexts like India or in other global south contexts. So we entered with the assumption that the data center impact conversation or discourse would be different in India. But our first hurdle was that we didn't know where the data centers were. And we had spoken to Arpita and her team at DEF at that time. We'd spoken to a few folks who were working on like land issues and trying to understand how to enter the space in some sense as well, because we do research on AI impacts for sure, but this is more of like an infrastructure related question of where are these data centers physically located. So that was like a methodological challenge for us also in some way to kind of how to even like go about this. And another piece was also being very careful about how we enter these spaces, right? Like using like our ethics of care, making sure that we don't enter with kind of like an extractive lens towards information, but to kind of also just understand how these spaces are. So then we landed on the fact that maybe we don't start with a movie, we don't start with a documentary. We start with figuring out what a research methodology would be for understanding the data center conversation in India. And that's how we landed on this report with support from the Green Screen Coalition on just framing this discourse in some sense in the Indian context, right? Like, what are these impacts? Does the energy, water, resource consumption conversation look the same in India? And then how it also aligns with India's larger, like the government's policies on AI. So that's how we kind of like went the report route instead of going a documentary route.
In India, we see growing resistance now slowly. It's coming up because Google data center is coming in Vizag and Visakhapatnam, which is in Andhra Pradesh, southern state of India. It's actually Telangana's neighboring state. It was the undivided state, and then recently Telangana and Andhra Pradesh have bifurcated. So in the state of Andhra Pradesh, we have one of the largest Google center data centers coming up, and there is some resistance that's growing in the region.
Yeah, I think that's around the world, and I feel like, just correct me if I'm wrong, from what you said, this is like a resistance against the resource use, but also a resistance against the false promise, so to say, of what it could bring.
Moving to another question, Donna, your report points out to a very common rhetorical strategy of global investors of data infrastructures, and that is to call what you name speculative overbuild essentially an AI boom. So, in the context of India, what do you think are the implications of this speculative overbuild. We see that the investors are not really thinking about maintaining these buildings for a long time. The maintenance plans are short, and there are also no strategies for upkeeping them in the future. So what are we risking, or what is India risking by leaving these buildings be?
Yeah, this was when we were doing our research. I think Meredith had found this particular statistic in a Cushman and Wakefield report that said that some 44% of co-location data centers in India have vacancies, and this was like in cities like Delhi, and which was slightly surprising for us because that's at the same time we were also coming across these reports that said that there is a lot of investment interest in data centers, but folks are like investing with 5 to 10 year plans in mind and no thought as to what would happen to these data centers post that, like who's going to pay or maintain these data centers once those that 5 year or 10 year contractual period ends. And the immediate kind of analogy that also came to mind was during the 2020, like the pandemic in the US. There was a lot of boom in building warehouses because people were moving to online shopping. You needed places to store these goods, and so there was this construction frenzy in building these warehouses. And then in 2025, around that time, like post COVID, there was not that much interest in this warehouse anymore. And there were a lot of empty warehouses they were just lying vacant and not being used. And now there are plans to kind of repurpose it, like figuring out where else can it be used. I remember reading somewhere there's also interest in like turning warehouses into data centers in some parts of the world. So there's this like perhaps like full circle at some point. But then we have had these kind of like construction booms in the past, like even India's history. And the question here is also like who really benefits then in the near term and the long term as well. There was a Knight Frank report, I think, from last year on retail spaces in India, and it found that in some cities like Nagpur, like which we consider tier 2 cities of India, there's like 40% retail spaces are vacant. These are like malls, so they call them ghost malls because there's not enough shops or businesses occupying the entire space of that mall. So we've had these histories of empty or vacant warehouses or empty or vacant infrastructure that just takes up a lot of space. And like going back to this point, and these are essentially like even in architecture, in design language, like this is essentially like new industrial bodies that are housing machines. You're building these concrete structures to house machines with no foresight into what happens once they stop functioning or serve that particular purpose. And in the speculative overbuild context, the other is that we also feel that at this point in time, at least, the supply of data centers is outpacing its demand. And we do wonder how this kind of would align with, like, the government of India is very keen on frugal AI, on small models, small AI models. Even at the India AI Impact Summit, there was like a working group on resilience and efficiency. And there is an acknowledgement that we actually don't have the resources needed to run these like massive compute LLMs. So therefore, there is a focus on smaller language models or smaller building like sovereign models, etc. The question then is that what happens to these data centers that big tech or large companies, foreign companies are building in India once that happens? And I think like going by what has happened in the past, like, and we have like an example of a real estate venture in India on the Western Ghats called Lavasa, which was a massive project which was cleared without proper environmental impact assessments, etc. And it's been abandoned. It's just sitting there. And during that process, for that, a lot of agricultural land was taken over. So this is again like this history of dispossession, and people had to move, people protested, they had to move, they were relocated, moved far away, displaced from those places. And it's like a massive waste of resources, but then at that point in time, it would have benefited certain groups. So data centers, we're also seeing following the similar pattern of it is beneficial to a specific group of stakeholders. Like there's a lot of interest in real estate firms to build data centers. So when you go through websites of different real estate firms in India, they might have sections which say that invest in a data center because that's assured returns for the next 5 years. Right. So it's actually like it is replicating patterns of like this concentration of wealth and power with specific actors in this ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's a really good analysis because I also think there's a big difference between real estate and, let's say, tech firms or the government itself building data centers. And both of the reports that you mentioned is basically real estate firms touting themselves how great this market is and how we need more, but they are also the ones doing the brokering and really benefiting from that, while at the same time, for every piece of land that's being allocated, you also allocate water resources, you allocate electrical resources, and you essentially blocking vital resources for any other development, right? That doesn't matter if it's good or bad, but it's not possible to do anything else. And I think it's striking that this is not just, I think that's not just a phenomenon in India. I think it's around the world. But I also don't know what we're supposed to do. I'm very technical, right? I don't know what we're supposed to do with all these data centers. Like, it doesn't matter how many technologies you're going to invent. I don't know how we're going to fill them, to be really honest.
Yeah, I mean, also just responding to that, like one of the other things that we came across was this creation of edge data centers. So there's a lot of interest in moving away from like your big cities towards inland, towards India, at least in the Indian context. But we read about like states like Madhya Pradesh, etc., where the operational costs of running a data center will be lower. There'll be lower latency. You're closer to the folks or users that you're giving the services to, but it's not seen a lot of uptake. But then we also came across these reports that said that some of these data center developers have already bought a lot of real estate in these places, and they're just waiting for like those plans to materialize, etc. So I'll be interested if someone does some research and kind of also finding these patterns between like these are real estate companies and these are also might be similar, or like family organizations, subsidiaries that might be running or developing data center construction sites as well.
So now comes the part of the podcast where we try to think collectively about what alternatives are there or solutions to the impacts that we have been talking about before. And that means also thinking about these alternatives globally and not just in the global north context. So, Dona, your DFL report also imagines the future of data centers for India and flags an important critique where solutions developed in Europe and the global north, such as using waste heat to warm residential buildings, don't really translate to India's tropical climate. So rather than importing someone else's alternative, I have a question for you both. Given everything that you know about India's specific conditions, being energy poverty, water stress, digital divides, but also the communities that you have been in touch with that bear the costs, what would an Indian model of data infrastructure look like? So one that is designed around these realities and for these realities and not really for the interest of the companies that build these data infrastructures.
Do you want to go first? Should I go first?
Okay, up to you. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Okay. I mean, quickly also just what we also meant with the residential heat point was that there was a lot of interest in, like using waste heat from data centers in different ways. And one of the prominent conversations that we saw was around using waste heat for heating up residential homes, which doesn't have a lot of like use in context like tropical climates, etc. But there's definitely scope for research into kind of figuring out how some of that waste heat can be utilized in a manner that kind of is sustainable. So there is definitely scope for research into that. I also see this as kind of like, if I want to frame it as two key issues, right? One is kind of the resource use issue with data centers, and the other is also kind of around how a lot of this actually replicates this thing of like disproportionate distribution of benefits, going back to the point that Max had also made earlier. And at the end of the day, like these replicate these patterns of where certain communities kind of end up becoming these sacrifice zones, where their land is taken or their resources are taken for, and it's like it's very utilitarian in the sense that it's for the greater good. And in some sense, there is also this AI exceptionalism that AI is going to do so much good, like even for the Indian context, like there's a lot of interest in AI for development, and therefore like a cost of a data center is very minimal compared to that. And you also have people like Eric Schmidt say that like you solve for like you build these data centers now, you build AI now, and it's going to solve your climate problems in the future. So there are these kind of like broad narratives, and I feel like the second part of it, this disproportionate distribution of benefits part, is slightly more trickier to kind of address in some sense. But the first part, like the resource use piece, of course, there is like given like the interest in small AI, frugal AI. I wonder if there is some way to kind of impose conditions of constraint on developers in some ways, right? That you cannot continue to function as if energy, water, etc. are infinite resources. Like these are finite resources. There is a certain end date or due date to these resources, and a lot of like global south contexts, folks are already like developers already work within those constraints, right? And I remember like from one of our podcasts on Code Green, Cindy Lin, who's a scholar, talks about collective restraint, and she doesn't call it constraint; she calls it collective restraint, where people don't have enough data, people don't have enough infrastructure, and therefore they innovate in those environments where you don't have access to like large compute infrastructure, etc. So if in policy spaces as well, if that can be like almost normalized, that you cannot assume that resources are infinite, I think that would go a long way. It would go into this like very fit for purpose kind of specific models. And the question is also that, do we really need these large language general purpose AI models, or do we go back to like the traditional, or kind of focus on the things that are like more fit for purpose or specific? And the second part on the disproportionate benefits and like how harms get distributed in this supply chain across the AI supply chain, at least in the Indian context, like for the time being, data centers don't undergo like this environmental impact assessment. There's no way communities can participate in this, and therefore like we see a lot of interesting initiatives in the global north around like community-oriented approaches to data centers, etc. Then going back to the point that Arpita was also making around how communities are not a homogeneous entity as well, right? Like communities might also have varying aspirations, and this is what economic benefit means for a particular section of this community versus the other. So, like building these meaningful ways to participate before the data center is even built in a specific place. So, and I'm not taking like an anti-data center stance. Like I realize that data centers, they service a lot of things and not just AI. Like they service this conversation essentially in some sense, right? So it is facilitating all of that as well. So maybe kind of like just narrowing the kind of lens that we have on like, okay, do we need hyperscalers or do we need data centers that can afford some kind of downtime, etc.? Doing that, mandating environmental impact assessments in its true form, like not just like on paper. Environmental impact assessments have been done, which have traditionally been the way for other industries as well. Doing that, and then we're also seeing a lot of like work that journalists are doing now, and like organizations like Digital Carbon Foundation working with on the ground, working with communities, bringing up those stories and like how these tangible impacts are being felt by communities. I think that's important. And then also kind of like attracting like philanthropic investments in some of these studies and research, etc. Like data centers or studying or understanding their impact should not be viewed as like anti-national, or you're working against the interest of the state. It's at the end of the day, communities are getting affected, so it's like a way to understand that and address that. I will stop here.
Okay, so I think Dona again covered everything, but I think some more reflections complementing Dona's inputs is I think so. Our organization is Digital Empowerment Foundation, but most times we actually are against digital only policies. So where you think that digital is inevitable, where AI is inevitable, and every sector, regardless of its need assessment or requirement assessment, technologies are being pushed, to cater to market needs, to commercial needs, to the needs of or and interests of the governments and the big techs. So I think we start there. I think so. So in policy making spaces, this conversation about the obsession with digital only policies, and also that AI is inevitable, or that infrastructures are inevitable, this, I think, we have to, in principle, philosophically also oppose. But I agree with Dona that infrastructures or any developmental model, for example, always comes with these very pressing concerns about how communities are affected and which communities are affected. There's always a section of society which benefits from these developmental agendas, and there is larger section of the society which gets affected by it. So in that premise, I think it's really very important that, one, of course, from a regulatory perspective, we how we started the conversation today, that how do we define it, how do we classify it? These conversations are extremely important, right? On other hand, it's also important to imagine other ways of understanding data centers, how it could be. like Dona said again, it could be an edge data center or some other model in technical terms. But I think at the core is how communities are, you know, whether they are passive recipients of these developments that are happening or are consciously at least trying to understand what's happening and responding in some capacity. So that participatory process is extremely important. So I think legislation should have by design, panchayats at the level of local governance. Panchayat is basically the local institution at the level in a village, right? So Panchayati Raj institution, PRI, should be part of this process of a consultation when any legislation is coming to a specific region. So any legislation applies to a specific region. Any policy applies to a specific region. Then second is, of course, apart from environmental impact assessment, it's not just one-time assessment. If criteria or metrics for understanding if it's efficient is not that some building has come up or some this amount of data is stored, etc., etc., if the metrics shifts from there to sustainability, then that assessment will be constant. It will be always going on the go. It's not just one time clearance that gives clean sheet to any big tech to just run it the way they want to, right? It has to be constant monitoring and accountability, and there should be that kind of regulatory mechanism which does that, right? And then very important is also land rights of communities who are losing lands. And somehow when we talk about infrastructures, we end up speaking in silos, that land rights are as important, forest rights are as important. When we're talking about water, power, of course, like we are talking about infrastructures, but farmers' rights are very important. So I think we'll need to have a very holistic overview of this situation and have that kind of understanding where we bring in experts from all of these sectors. There are so many people who are working very meaningfully at the grassroots who can give us very good assessment of how data centers in its current form or in its improvised form can accommodate the concerns, which therefore doesn't push the communities into gig economy, it doesn't push the communities into a perpetual financially very weak position, right? So that's two. And how do we go forward and what do we do about these data centers? I mean, it is a very tough question for all of us, that the inevitability of it is the toughest of all. Yes, it's going to stay. I think civil society organizations should have more seat at the table where these conversations are taking place, even in advocacy spaces, policy making spaces. The more we are able to do storytelling of how communities are navigating, hopefully that should inform that something is wrong in design that's clearly impacting people's lives in such a sad manner. So and the level of exclusion and the level of as in how people are struggling with it is massive, and that's completely hidden from all of these. It's happening as we speak. So yeah, I think I'll stop it on that note. Yeah.
I think listening to both of you, I have to say, so first of all, I completely agree with all of you, especially monitoring and constraints. I think that's very well put. As a wish, because I, of course, am not Indian, but as a wish, if we put it all together, we started in the beginning a little bit with benefits, the conversation about how do we benefit, and in a way, it's positive. The government is digitalizing its services, so you have digital services demand from that. Then you have foreign companies moving into the Indian market because they see, the citizens are so well digitalized. That's a great market opportunity. So we are going to sell our services as well. And with AI, of course, that even it gets even more. And all of that essentially drives demand for computation, right? Like, yes, they need to be in data centers, but it's ultimately driving demand for computation. And then real estate investors are basically moving in to build these facilities to sell the necessary computation, which is basically extracting rent from society, because it is the citizens that are using all these services that are essentially paying for the computation, which then somebody extracts again. And again, more as a wish, if we look at that as a market, so everybody needs compute, and if we can empower somehow communities around the world, to be honest, to participate in that in a way that they can build community-owned data centers, or like at least somehow participate, that it's more local businesses, local engineers that are building these facilities, and rather that the government takes a role in setting up that open market where every community, if they want a data center, they can own it, they can build it, they can decide how it's made, that it really fits their values, but that is not foreign investment funds or real estate developers simply using the community's resources and extracting rent from that community, both through the resources and through money. While India's economy is thriving, yes, but somehow it is thriving because citizens are consuming digital things, but are not getting any of the value returned to them aside from what is always, the productivity gain. But if you ask me as a citizen, I don't necessarily want to be more productive all the time. I want to have a better quality of life, right? Not be a even better, more efficient worker. So that would be my wish, like listening to both of you, like leveling it up. I know it's a big wish, but I think being able to participate in digital infrastructure, all of us, I think that would be also a meaningful step forward.
Absolutely. Just one thing that I think awareness, consciousness, it's not awareness. I think more
Absolutely.
than that, consciousness is very much required, and engagement with communities at various levels is required. And like you said, it's very important, and it's true that it's such a deep irony that on one hand, India's metrics for digital growth is seen in terms of number of smartphone users or number of AI applications or innovations, or the number of investments in today's times. But the deepest irony is half of the country is still not meaningfully connected for accessing welfare services, and then that's as basic as that, and then that's where the problems start, digital divide. And then there are these pressing concerns that we are trying to cope with. So, and in the context of US, we do see there are best practices coming in from communities who are showing us some way, and they are resisting and locally even like stalling data center projects. It's courageous and very inspiring. But of course, depends on which country we are in, the local political context, that how resistance is allowed or not allowed, how it's tackled. So it comes with a price that many communities face for resisting.
Yeah, and ultimately communities should have a choice. For me, it's always, I'm not trying to be so prescriptive, but I'm just saying, like, everybody should be able to choose. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Dona, is there any closing remarks that you want to share?
Sure. I think like hearing Max speak, I was wondering if there is also scope to learn, like when we're thinking of community oriented approaches towards like this physical infrastructure, data centers, if there's something to learn even from kind of the sovereignty movements in different parts of the world, like how communities have like taken back control over like how their data is processed, like their language data. The Maori folks, there's a lot of work that's happening in Africa in this context as well. And the essential idea is that there is a lot of autonomy over how the data is used, how it's reused, who gets to share it with whom and for what purposes. So communities kind of exercise that control over data. Of course, like in different contexts, how much control people would want over their data, if they would like to hand it over to a fiduciary, all of that would change. But I feel there might be some lessons we can even take from there, and also like ultimately like make these connections about like every digital device we use, or like the moment you're using say a chat GPT or a Claude, the supply chain has like large hands. It's like a hydra headed monster that has like its tentacles across the world. So your critical minerals are coming from Southeast Asia, from Africa, like from Congo, where there's a lot of forced labor, there's child labor involved, and the people working in hazardous conditions extracting all of that. There's and these critical minerals also are supplying the energy transition movement in some sense, right? So just also being aware in some sense, and going back to what Arpita was saying, like of realizing that like everything that we're using or everything that is facilitated through services, yeah, there is a social cost to each of these processes, like across the supply chain, across the AI supply chain, across digital devices that we use. So we're conscious of that, and I see a lot of like younger folks, especially like upcoming generations, being very conscious about how they use digital devices, and being like, okay, I'm not going to use ChatGPT or Claude for strange purposes or for asking strange questions, etc. So there is definitely that consciousness, but also realizing that not everyone has access to the digital world. Like no matter how we talk about like the digitalization, transformation, enabling access, etc., realizing that those benefits, etc., are still concentrated in some sectors. And at the end of the day, data centers and all of this would most likely then also benefit certain sections and groups and communities.
I think all three of our organizations are already contributing to this wish that Max mentioned. So thank you very much for finding time to talk to me today about making this wish happen, or finding the solutions to make it happen. And I wish you a lot of energy and strength to continue to doing the great work that you do. Thank you very much, Arpita and Dona and Max, for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Susanna.
This was Where the Cloud Touches the Ground. Thank you for listening to a special podcast series by Leitmotiv. To follow all of our podcast series, visit our Paradigms channel on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Osha. For episode summaries, current activism projects, and link to work of our guest speakers, sign up for our newsletter through the link in the description.